So good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is Guy Christian Agbo with Goal 16 podcast. Today we have a special guest from Montreal, Canada. Her name is Miss Allison Christian. She has her last name is just like my first name, but we are not related. But I guess we are now through Zoom and through this subject. So Miss Allison Christian is a tax scholar, and she's the Heward Stikeman Chair in Tax Law at the McGill University Faculty of Law, or they say Faculté de Droit, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And her research and teaching focus on Canadian and U.S. domestic and broader international law and policy issues, with an emphasis on the relationship between taxation and economic development, and on the role of the government and non-government institutions and actors in the creation of tax policy norms. And I have to tell you, she is one of the best tax researcher and tax professor that I ever met, because she was awarded in 2014 the John Ford Prize in Teaching Excellence by the Law Student Association of McGill University. She has taught all over the world. So please join me to welcome Allison. Allison, welcome to our podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much, Guy Christian. And it's true, we aren't related, but somehow we are going through life with the same name. So we'll commiserate or accept our fate on that. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Right. Perfect. So just to remind our audience, she is in Montreal right now. I'm in New York. So we're going to do that. We don't have that conversation on Zoom, thanks to Zoom. Allison, let me start by asking you. I mean, I know you did a lot of research on the FATCA, which is the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. I just want to have your own perspective on what you've written extensively about that. But what is more important to you that you wrote about?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think that's been a tough area of law for me, because I don't condone tax evasion, and I don't think that we should have systems where tax evasion is made easy for people. But at the same time, I had a lot of quarrels with FATCA, and if you've ever read anything I've written about it, it's mostly complaining. It's complaining. It's complaining about not FATCA so much as what it enforces and what countries agree to. And that is the extremely unusual and unacceptable, normatively unjustified practice of the U.S. in taxing people who are U.S. citizens, even if they never touch the soil in the U.S., even if they have no financial ties to the U.S. And so, I live in Canada. There's a lot of people here who have dual citizenship by birth. They were just born to a U.S. parent. And the U.S. claimed them just the same as they would claim somebody who spends their whole life in the U.S. And so Canada, turned its whole banking system upside down to help the U.S. find these people who don't have social security numbers, don't have any U.S. income, no financial ties, and have lived their whole lives in another jurisdiction. And they're not tax evaders. Their money is in a Canadian bank account, and they earn Canadian wage income. And a lot of those people were older, and they had no idea what was going on. And the U.S. started hitting them with massive fines that weren't tax fines. They were financial reporting fines, not tax. They were not tax evaders. They were form evaders. So that most of my complaining was in that area, trying to explain that taxing people who have no connection to your jurisdiction is actually not justified, not normatively justified. And, that's a complicated message when you are also cognizant that people who do have connections to your jurisdiction can't be allowed to skirt the law by going somewhere else and hiding somewhere else.
Right. So just for the audience to understand what this act, this Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act is all about. This is an act that was enacted by Congress to, I mean, they claim to curb tax avoidance by U.S. person by requiring that any bank around the world that holds an account of a U.S. person report the financial information relating to that bank account to the Internal Revenue Service, among other things, right?
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it's the backbone of what becomes the common reporting standard at the OECD, which is a global information sharing. But you'll notice the US does not agree to global information sharing and hasn't signed on to the common reporting standard. So an interesting thing happened along the way. The US created rules that would say that no other country can harbor US tax evaders. And then refused to cooperate when other countries said that's a good idea and we want to make sure no one is harboring our tax evaders either, including the United States. And it made the US into, some argue, the last tax haven standing in terms of being a secrecy jurisdiction. So there's all kinds of issues involved in that. It all sounds right when you look at it on paper, and then the way it turns out doesn't always match with the intention.
Allison, let me ask you this. Does the fact that the US and Canada, for example, have a tax treaty together, does that help resolving this FATCA issue or not?
Well, interestingly enough, when the FATCA was first passed in 2010, this was the first reaction of Canada. First, we already have a tax treaty, but more importantly, we already have automatic exchange of information, and that is encapsulated in US law. And in fact, all of the US agreements with other countries were based on a deal it already had with Canada. But it still enforced its will on Canada anyway by requiring Canada to sign onto a new agreement under which Canada just gave a whole lot more information and a lot of more help to the United States to ferret out, catch and turn over its own Canadian citizens, right? So, Canada was in a weird spot. It was the only jurisdiction when FATCA was announced. Canada was already doing bank account reporting. It was the only jurisdiction that was doing that. So you would have thought, well, why do we need more? We're already doing our part. And so you might say, well, you need more because you need it to be reciprocal. But the US didn't change any way in which they provided information to Canada. They changed nothing. They only required more from Canada, which is, Canada is a small jurisdiction, and the US often can just name its terms in the past, and it has done that, and I think that's where it is. And again, like the political salience of that regime it's to stop tax evasion. Who would be against that? So it's only in the wrinkle that it also seems to impose a lot of fines and a lot of trouble on people who are not tax evaders in any way, shape, or form. They're simply people who didn't file the right forms in what they consider to be a foreign country, right? But the treaty actually was violated by FATCA. FATCA was a treaty override, and the intergovernmental agreement to enforce it was a treaty override, as it was in all cases, because it just imposed a unilateral demand on all treaty countries to agree with the terms that the US had set out in its own internal law. It turns out to have, been sort of okay in the sense that the common reporting standard was born as a result of it. So in terms of those who are interested in illicit financial flows, I think it went a long way. Like, the world was really at an impasse before that happened. But why was it at an impasse? It was at an impasse because the US itself refused to sign on to the international effort to stop tax evasion that had gone on before FATCA. And that's the Harmful Tax Practices Program. So you really have to rewind, right? Like, this is complicated. The OECD was working on shutting down bank secrecy as part of the Harmful Tax Practices Initiative, which they started in '99. The US was going along with that for a long time until they changed their minds. And you can read Stephen Dean's got an article in the Tax Notes recently that kind of walks through that. Very fascinating article, worth your listeners' attention, where he explains why that happened. But the upshot is the US backed away from the harmful tax practices, which crumbled that idea of automatic exchange of information and completely stopped information exchange without, these TIAs, tax information exchange agreements, only to then pick it up later, do it themselves, do it their own way, and then impose that on the rest of the world and then not cooperate again. So that's a complicated story from the US, and it's a bit of a inconsistent story. On the one hand, the US does not want Americans tax evading. On the other hand, the US does not mind people in other countries using the US to evade tax elsewhere. That's not a justifiable position in any book, I don't think.
Right. 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 But if I recall correctly, if my memory is accurate, when I was in law school in Miami in 2001, I was taking. That's where I got my certificate of international taxation, and at the time it was understood that Canadians will use the US as a tax shelter. Was that accurate? Was that an accurate statement, or it was just an illusion? Because I know there is another expert in the name of, I believe is Alain Denault.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So who has argued, several times that Canada was another tax evasion country as well as an onshore country, but I just want to have your own perspective on that issue.
Yeah. I think Alain's work really focused on companies, and especially mining companies.
Right.
I think individuals do not use Canada to evade tax, and I'm not, I'd have to go back and see what his arguments were on the other kinds of taxpayers. But in 2001, the focus of the US on tax evasion in 2001 was not Canada, but it was island nations, right, where Americans were opening up Visa credit cards, lines of credit, and they were stashing income offshore. But all of a sudden, the visa situation made it easy for anyone to basically hide the money offshore, but still have full access to it at all times. Right. That was really the worry. And whether Canada was part of that, maybe so. Alain would know better than I do. It's not something I studied, right? I think, in terms of FATCA, I'm not thinking about does Canada have a tax evasion problem. I think there are many people who think that every country has their own tax evasion problem, and that the common reporting standard was a way to resolve some of that. But the same principle always holds. As long as there's one jurisdiction that is willing to put your money in a bank and not tell anyone about it, then you don't have tax evasion solved. And right now, the biggest jurisdiction in the world that's willing to let you do that is the United States. Right. It's ironic, but that's where it is. And that has not been solved. And in theory, I suppose it won't be solved, because there are plenty of people who say the US, and they're not shy about saying this, the US banking system relies on money fleeing other countries, including to hide. And in fact, I've heard people make a moral case for this. They say, well, the other country is corrupt, or they're going to steal the money, or they might kidnap somebody. And so it's good and just and right for the US to hide the money if the other country is going to, steal it from you or oppress you because of it. But, somehow that moral rationale doesn't quite hold when you think that the US is not only helping people who are trying to avoid a oppressive regime, but apparently willing to help anybody. Right. That's a tough situation to be in.
Right. Let me ask you this. Have you been aware of what the position of Canada is with respect to the illicit financial flow definition? I know the US and some Western countries, I'm not sure about Canada, but I just want to have your perspective on that. If they have accepted what the UN definition of illicit financial flows are.
I think so. I'd have to go take another look at that. But I think they're generally accept that language. I myself am not 100% sure I accept that language.
What is your definition? It's good. It's good to ask you. So, it's good to exchange, to have that perspective, your perspective on that issue. How would you define illicit financial flow?
Well, so I think that question itself is what I would take issue with. I'm not sure I would define it, right? So I will just take a different position, which is, the law has a job to do. It has to decide what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. Right. And in deciding what is not acceptable behavior, that's, you have to come up with some way to be able to judge that the same for everyone. That's why we call it law. So illicit is sort of trying to ride the line between, well, it's legal, but I don't like it. That's the Margaret Hodge school of rationale, you know, in terms of Google. It's legal. I'm not accusing you of being illegal. I'm accusing you of being immoral.
Right.
She's proposing that as a substitute for law. And I tend to be on the other side, not formalistically, but to say law has to be something that people can look to and say, this is the rule. And there are decision makers who are going to decide if you're breaking the rule. Mm-hmm. And when you start talking about illicit, for me, it's just too easy to collapse those two between a political, moral case and what the law actually does. And I think it lets law off the hook in a way. It's like, well, the law didn't quite work, so now we're going to go to something else. And my argument, this is not only my own argument, I think you could trace this to Judith Friedman, has been very influential in this area, from Judith Friedman from the UK, which talks about, you know, the general anti-avoidance rules and SARS, specific anti-avoidance rules. The rationale, the purpose for those kind of rules are to flesh out an area of law which is difficult to solidify in the statute, right? What's that do? What do GARs and SARs do? They provide decision makers the tools to be able to assess whether behavior falls on the right side, it's legal, or on the wrong side, it's not. And that's how a law system has to be. And when we start talking about illicit, I start getting nervous because I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing. So that's where I take issue with it. It doesn't mean that I think you can't talk about illicit financial flows. I have many people whose views I respect who think that there's a certain power in this language. And I accept that power. I understand that power, but it's a political power that's really hard for lawyers to work with. I mean, if you say something's illicit, I don't have a remedy for illicit. I only have a remedy for illegal. So I want to, you know, that's where I want to situate most of my energy in stopping. If I really want to stop some behavior, then it first has to be clear that the behavior is wrong as a matter of law. And law is supposed to reflect our shared morality, right? And if it doesn't, then we need to fix it. And if we can't fix it, then we need to fix the way that decision makers are going to interpret, apply, and implement the law. That's kind of where I sit.
Good. You see, I was sure that I was going to be impressed by what you had to say. So I'm well served. Thank you. Now let me go into something that I've always been thinking about. Let's say you, Allison, I just became elected as the president of some Republic of Motherland in Africa. So this Republic of Motherland does not have a tax regime or a fiscal policy. We have nothing. We just, they just gave us one of this colony, France, Great Britain, just gave us independence. We got our independence a few days ago. And, you know, I was recommended to you. I mean, you are a tax specialist, you are a tax expert, you're a tax professor. And I want you, if you could, to design us a tax regime or a tax program, a tax, you know, the whole 9 yards. So what would you do? What would you recommend that we do?
Well, you know, it's easy, right? It's no problem. I'll write this for you, right? Wrong. The first thing I would say is you shouldn't be asking me. You should be asking everyone in your country who's an expert on the law that you've been dealing with until now. And those experts know something about the cultural and social implications of the laws that you've had in place, even if those laws that you had in place were the result of colonial rule, as they have been all over the world. I think the long-term destruction of social and cultural heritage can be traced to the decision to go to the foreigner and ask them what to do. So I wouldn't be party to that. I wouldn't accept the job. So if you came and asked me what should it look like, I would say, I don't know. What do your experts think it should look like? And then if someone would say, well, we have experts and here are their expertise areas, but we're missing this particular form of expertise. Then, and if you were to come to me and say, then Now that we're missing this piece, how can we build that piece?
Good.
Then I would say, okay, well, we have short and medium and long term. In the short term, let's get together, your experts, with people who are expert in that missing piece, and do some exploration about what that missing piece means in terms of your tax system. Is it fatal to the design of your tax system, so you need to fix it? And work as a collaboration to fix it. And then medium term, obviously, I think I'm an educator, right? I'm a professor first.
Right.
So of course, I'm going to say what is the main thing to do is to train your next generation of tax administrators, judges, and practitioners. And so that's where I would, look for your universities. So what are the resources of your universities to provide tax training? What kind of resources do they have to collaborate? Because the thing that I think has been missing in tax systems the world over, Canada is no exception to this, I think we're missing this too, is diversity in the lawmaking and policymaking sphere, collaboration amongst different people, younger people, older people, people with less experience, people with more, people who are accountants, economists, yes, lawyers, political scientists, right? There needs to be collaboration across the board. And once you have those mechanisms for collaboration in place, in theory, you should be able to figure out where should we spend our precious time and energy, what should we work on, and then if there's someone in the world who's an expert, then you can consult their ideas, but you don't let them take over that project, right? You have to own that project yourself, because only you know what is really at stake for your population.
Right. But,
I'm sorry, I can't write you a...
You're preaching to the choir. You're preaching to the choir here, because that's exactly what I would do. But you and I know that that's not the reality in Africa.
It's not how we've done it in the past. Yeah, I agree with you.
That's not how things work. But I mean, if I have to push back on that argument that you just provided, I'm gonna say yes, fine, okay. In the meantime, why are we looking forward to have this building capacity where we have to train new individuals to be able to care for the tax administration, to be specialized in area that we lack really human power. It's going to take a while to have these people, but in the meantime, right now, we have a lot of issues. I mean, developing countries have a lot of issues with respect to tax administration, with respect to tax policy itself, with respect to international taxation, whether they are inbound or outbound cross-border transactions. So, I mean, you as an expert, what would you advise a country that has tax administration? Because I'm going to go now from step to step. Yes, we just, like I said, they gave it to us yesterday. So we don't have the time and we don't have the resources, neither to be able to build something in the long term. We're supposed to do that, but it's going to take a while. And in the meantime, we have to operate. So how do we operate in such a way that we can mobilize the resources that are needed to help our population, socially, economically, medically, and so forth? How do we do that?
So again, it's a tough question, and I'm going to turn it back on my own country to understand what role we play in this, right? So I accept what you're saying, and I agree that this is a challenge, and that's why I suggest collaboration with outside experts is not off the table. That's an acceptable way to do policy. Learning policy emulation is a perfectly acceptable way for countries to operate. Like just as we talked about FATCA and CRS, arguably there's some policy emulation going back and forth amongst the member countries of the OECD. So that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I think what I would say is that, countries like Canada, the U.S., Europe, we need to be looking very hard at our spillovers, right? So we need to be looking at how the rules that we have policy emulated from each other, right, have effects on the tax capacity and really the forms of taxation that developing countries can choose. So if you've read any of my stuff, I talk a little bit about building a more sustainable global tax system and what I'm proposing. And that's a proposal, like it's a policy proposal, right? It's a, here's something I think a country could do right now with the rules we have in place right now. And that is to basically my whole structure of the way I think about things right now is that the countries of the OECD, back when they were the countries of the League of Nations, developed an entire global system on the concept that source taxation should be curtailed.
Right.
That is the source, that is the root cause of problems for every country that has a hard time taxing today. Yes, taxing at residence, like we saw with FATCA, is hard as well, but taxing at source is a major barrier to, the curtailment of taxing at source is a major barrier for a lot of countries, not just poor countries, countries of all development levels. But we built the system to curtail it. So that seems to me the mistake. We need to fix it. We need to reverse that error altogether. But it's really hard for an individual country to just start, imposing source-based tax. Look at the digital services tax regime. What's happening there? For example, if you look at Nigeria's SEP proposal, where they're going to expand nexus for income taxation to non-physical presence having foreign entities, the pushback on that is, well, that's not yours. It's not your income tax according to, international norms and consensus. And I would argue the opposite is the case. That is, we need to go back in and look at the things that we've actually agreed to. And then wherever you can, the main goal should be carve more at source and work through the tax treaties that you have to get countries like Canada and Europe and the United States to cooperate by giving corresponding adjustments. So this is pretty technical. We don't want to go into technical details, but the basic thrust of this is where can you get more tax at source that does not involve straying from the international consensus as we have now? How far can you push out the boundary with the rules that other countries expect right now? And I think there's more flexibility there than a lot of countries are willing to admit. I think there's much more flexibility. And so that would be where I would spend my time in the immediate term, is use the rules that exist now, the ways that people think about things now, push the boundaries out as far as possible, get as much as you can, and then start working on systemic reform to push those boundaries out further past where we're comfortable now.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. Now, what do you think, developing countries should do with respect to this international tax treaty? I mean, do you think international tax treaty are made in their advantage of these developing countries?
Well, so you see a lot of countries revisiting some of their existing tax treaties to undo, to reverse some negative effects, but mostly from the curtailment of tax at source and some based on some lack of base protection rules. So there's a school of thought that says developing countries should not have tax treaties at all because they're so one-sided. And I used to count myself in that camp. But there might be a reason to have a tax treaty that, if you can get the right mix on source, if you can not give away too much source, there might be a good reason to have a tax treaty. And this is a little technical, but I think it's worth it to kind of just explore it a little bit. And it's in the mutual agreement. It's in the dispute resolution. That there's some potential. And I'm not talking about arbitration. I don't believe that we should be talking about arbitration just yet. I'm talking more about that when there's a dispute resolution provision in a treaty, then in theory, there's a way to work with the other countries to reallocate the income in a way that doesn't cause double taxation. And that's why, again, I always assume that whatever I think would be the right way to do tax policy is not the way the world is going to make tax policy.
Right.
The way they're going to make tax policies the way they always did, they're going to listen to the big important players. They're going to forge a consensus that works for those players, and they're going to ignore, you know, the needs of developing countries for the most part.
Yeah.
So if that's true, and I'm a realist about that, then at least what treaties will give you is if you don't give away too much source, if you hang on to source tax as much as you can,
Mm-hmm.
then when you make those claims about source, there's a chance you could get the other country to give an adjustment on their side that will reduce double taxation.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, because you have to think of it from the investor's point of view, if you're going to pay a tax in country A or country B, you want to pay a tax in one or the other, but not both. The treaty is the way to make sure you pay in one or the other and not both.
Right.
Otherwise, you know, they don't have to cooperate with you.
Yeah.
So I think there's room for a tax treaty. You have to be so careful in protecting source-based taxation. And I think that's hard. And I appreciate that's hard. I would want to work with people who have negotiated tax treaties in the past. I know the International Senior Lawyers Project has a program that works on this. I would defer to people who do that kind of stuff to say, well, what are the ways to protect yourself from a tax treaty that really is going to hollow out your base, and then really work on understanding that a tax treaty is not just a set of rules, it's a diplomatic exchange between nations, which should be carried out according to the Vienna Convention, you know, in good faith.
Yeah.
And what else can we do, really, if you have the problem that international capital is looking for the lowest possible tax, and if you get double taxed, there you run the risk of losing it. The best thing you can do is not impose taxes where they're on top of some other country's tax. The best thing you could possibly do is impose a tax that shifts it from a developed country like the U.S. or Europe to the developing country. And that we could do with greater source taxation through a tax treaty.
Yeah, but Allison,
in theory.
If I may, you know, you talk about this source issue, right? Now, the source issue, I'll give you a good example of ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is a company located in so many African countries, which are all of them developing countries. Now, ExxonMobil, with respect to what I know, America, the U.S. does not have that many tax treaties with African countries.
That's right.
There are very few of them. You know, there's a bilateral trade agreement, which they have a bunch of with all these countries. Now, they don't even rely on those tax treaty because
they bypass them. Yeah.
Tax schemes.
Yeah. Investment promotion. Yeah.
That's right. That they have, and the money does not even come here.
Yeah.
The money that ExxonMobil has ever made in Africa never came to America directly. So it was, for them, it's not even an issue. So I wonder if, you know, the developing countries are actually getting implicated in a wrong debate. Because when you look at it, very few countries right now are taking advantage of that tax treaty. Specifically, one that is on target right now to many African countries is the island of Mauritius, right?
Right.
We have 2 or 3 countries right now that have completely annihilated that tax treaty with Mauritius, because they came to the conclusion that Mauritius is taking, that tax treaty was taking resources out of their countries, you know, and putting it into Mauritius. That's why Mauritius is so rich, because I cannot explain how a small country like Mauritius would be the first. I mean, you look at the island in terms of people, geographically speaking, and everything else, is a small, tiny island, but is the biggest and the first investor in India. I mean, that don't make sense.
Right.
That don't make sense at all.
Well, it makes perfect sense in the sense that investors don't want to pay taxes. So if you want investment,
Investors don't want to pay taxes. Here we go.
Right.
Yeah,
some don't want to pay taxes, right? And so if there's an option to scrape the base out of a country that's going to impose tax,
Mm-hmm.
then they will take that option. But it's an opportunity cost, right? So if you take away the opportunity cost, if that's not an option,
Mm-hmm.
then they won't do that, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, you know, what Mauritius is doing is creating an opportunity cost to investing in Africa, is making local taxes in African countries higher than they would be,
Right.
absent the absent going in there and making it a different option. So it's perfectly acceptable and understandable why you would want to take Mauritius out of the picture and remove that opportunity as an alternative to direct investment. Now, the argument I think that people will make is, oh, but then the opportunity cost won't be investment in your country through Mauritius. It will be investment in some other country altogether that taxes less than you.
They will find Bahamas, they will find some other country. I mean, the advantage was that's
the danger.
Mauritius was, I think, is the single country that has most tax treaty with African countries.
Yeah.
Even though Mauritius is an African country itself, right?
Yeah.
So their point of sale, their way of selling the hub of Mauritius as the place to invest and to, you know, to register a corporation was because they have all these tax treaty that they have signed with African countries. I don't know if when the African countries were signing those treaties, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
Because then that falls within the concept that I know many of these countries don't have the know-how about tax treaty, because why would you sign a treaty with a country like that? I mean, why?
Well, I think you would sign it if someone does a very good job convincing you that the opportunity cost to investors is too high relative to other countries, and Mauritius can make your country more attractive to foreign investors.
Yeah, but
I mean,
if you do the microeconomic analysis, you know, and you realize that, okay, in very, very late terms, when they come to your country, they are investing, yes, they're giving jobs, but they are taking resources out of the country, or they are making money by investing their money by giving jobs to these people, and they are not paying taxes to this country, and they are not paying taxes in Mauritius either.
Right.
I mean, at the end of the day, both countries end up losing. What Mauritius gaining there?
Well, Mauritius gains of
5% of, you know, if they even pay that, you know, because at the end of the day, they end up even putting more schemes where Mauritius end up being a country where a pass-through jurisdiction where they have to, you know, I mean, it's ludicrous. So I think that, African countries, some of them, there are some tax treaties that are necessary. I mean, if you have a tax treaty with the U.S., that's why there's no U.S. tax treaty with many African countries, except South Africa, that I know of. Maybe
because you don't need it because of Mauritius. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, because at the end of the day, what happened is that these companies, you know, for example, Exxon, they don't even need the U.S. They don't need their tax treaty. Because
well, let's untangle that a little bit, right? Because they don't need a tax treaty for multiple reasons. Mauritius could be one of them. That is, if you have a treaty with Mauritius, you have a treaty with the world, because Mauritius effectively reduces the taxation to zero, and then Mauritius doesn't have a withholding tax going out. So that's why you don't need a treaty with a country that has a treaty with Mauritius, which reduces tax at source, right? So that's one option. But the other option is that Exxon or a lot of mining companies, they don't care about the treaties, and they also don't care about domestic law because they have a contract. They have an investment promotion agreement. They have a stabilization clause. They have all of these special, you know, bells and whistles. Some of them signed 30 years ago. And those contracts are really good at freezing government reform. And so my guess is almost any big foreign company that's engaged in mining or resource sector has some kind of investment promotion contract which to them, it's irrelevant what's going on in the rest of the country. And that, that's a different problem. I was at a conference once, and, I was taught by someone from, I think it was Cameroon, about, just exactly how destructive these agreements could be. And, after hearing about that, I'd sort of heard a little bit, and I looked further into that. But yeah, those agreements, some of them are 30 years old, and they're endless. They seem to be endless. And even if they don't actually prevent a government from changing, fixing its tax regime, the companies will say, yeah, okay, you're going to reform the tax system, you're going to increase our taxes. That's fine for everybody else, but it's not for us. And they hold up the agreement and they say, we're going to sue you. We're going to take you to arbitration. There's an investor state dispute resolution in there. So there's a mix of, yes, treaties, tax treaties, yes, domestic law that gives away the farm, because there's a sense that you're trying to get foreign investment capital at virtually any cost. And then there's investment promotion and other agreements, stabilization clauses of all kinds. And there's a whole web of these things, right? So they all draw down, I think, to the basic insight, though. And here it is. If a source country does not tax investment capital, then the only reason you would want investment capital is if you think the employment prospects and consumption prospects are increased by the investment capital. Right. If you don't think that your employment and in consumption, local consumption prospects are increased by the foreign capital, then, and you give away all of the tax system, then it sort of doesn't matter how you give it away. You've given it away. Yeah. So that calculation, that's a hard calculation, I think, for governments to make. Like, they have a hard time trying to work that out. Like, is foreign capital going to create positive spillovers enough that I can forego tax law? And I will add to that the frustration that I have being, watching this from afar and watching it from the developed country point of view is, we have had no problem whatsoever allowing our investment capital to exploit not just foreign tax laws, foreign labor laws, foreign environmental laws. We have had almost no problem with that, even though, and we know what happens. Our companies go to countries, they don't necessarily make the laws that fail to protect workers and the environment, but they sure benefit from them. And then they bring those profits back home to me, the pension holder, the saver in the developed world, and say that it belongs to me when all that destruction happened at source. And so every time a government makes that calculation to compete for foreign capital with labor regulation, with environmental regulation, and with tax regulation, that profit goes to me in a developed country. And I don't think that's right. Now, do I think it's immoral? I don't know. Do I think it's legal? You bet I do. I think it's legal, but I don't think it's correct as an economic matter. And so I'll spend my time trying to convince people to change their tax laws, because that's what I know. And labor lawyers will try to convince people to change the labor laws, and environmental leaders will try to talk about changing the environmental laws. But we know when it's like a balloon, when you put pressure on one point, it pops out in the other. So if you get decent labor standards, well, you're going to be sort of pressured into giving it up somewhere else. And if you have labor and environment lining up for protection, then we can see the tax system is going to be a focal point for the investor, because that's a way to make money, and a way to make money for who? For the shareholders back in the rich countries. So that is a systemic problem. It involves a number of different policies. And when the policymakers trying to work out what the tax system looks like, I appreciate how difficult that is, because you don't get to just sit in a vacuum and say, what would a nice tax policy look like? You have to take into account a pre-existing network of trade treaties, trade agreements with specific companies, the pressure of your environmental regulation. Can you enforce those regulations, labor regulations? And when you do that, you should be doing an economic assessment of whether that investment capital is really worth it. But if you can't do that and you can't decide whether it's worth it, and then the mantra of every politician is more foreign investment is good for the country, but you don't know if it is because all you're relying on is those spillovers, then we find ourselves in this situation. Yeah, that's a complicated problem. I don't know that I have a solution, but I will say that if you do not tax at source, then you are saying effectively, I accept the spillovers, the negative and the positive, and think that that's good for my country. And if no one is studying that, if that's not a priority area for study by local people who understand the cultural, social, economic context in which those laws are operating, if that doesn't take place there, then of course mistakes are going to be made in treaty negotiation. Of course they're going to be made. And frankly, of course other countries are going to exploit that lack of understanding. But why shouldn't they? No one says that countries have to be fair with each other. They only say that once you do have an agreement, you have to have good faith in carrying it out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Do you think, using the same concept of source, do you think we should be utilizing that same concept to be able to tackle the, the big issue of economic digitalization, or this issue that we have with Google, Amazon, and Facebook? Do you think we have
the GAFAs, the FANGs, right? Yeah. So I mean, to me, it's very clear that the digitalization project is a reckoning with an old decision that source requires physical things. That the establishing source, establishing that the taxpayer belongs to you or that the income belongs to you, establishing residence or source depends on physical things. And we decided that 100 years ago. Think about it, 100 years ago. I mean, we're sitting here on Zoom talking about the rule set that we're using was 100 years ago. It's absurd.
Nobody that we will be doing such a thing on Zoom.
Exactly. So it's of course there's a certain logic to it. So if you step back, you say, okay, you asked me to imagine a country that suddenly emerges from colonialism and has to come up with a tax system. And I counter with, imagine a country that wakes up one day and there is no tax system at all of any kind. Where do you start? You start by saying, well, who do we have that we can tax? And you look around and you say, okay, well, we have people who are here. Those are our residents. But we also have these people who come in and take stuff. And we don't want them to take that stuff. And in this case, what is the stuff that they're taking? In a digital economy, what is the stuff that they're taking? What is it? It's our identities, our dignity. These are not things that we can stop at the border and put a ticket on, put a stamp on. It's very, very difficult. But so we have to negotiate the terms of that. So I mentioned the Nigerian SEP, significant economic presence, which of course comes out of the G24 proposal to the OECD. They say the G24 at one point says, well, we think we should be examining here in the digital economy is not some new form of taxation and really nothing new at all. It's just an expansion of what we think creates nexus. And I'm here to tell you, I think when I read the word nexus, I think, could there have been a less theorized term in all of international taxes? There a term more misunderstood than nexus that has more packed into it than anyone can imagine. So if you look at the US, for example, the US has taken issue with France. Now, the whole world pays attention because the US and France are going to be in an argument. And what is the US argument? The US argument is, you, France, are not entitled to tax at source. Because there are these customs. The US is pointing to customs of international norms. They use the term norms. When does the US ever care about norms? They care about law, and in particular, US law. And they try to make an argument that France is doing something outside of norms. And now they have to try to connect that to a treaty somehow, because you can't just say, naughty, naughty, you're not doing something we expected you to do based on a norm. But what's the norm? And the argument that the US is making is, they actually say this. They say the norm of, physical presence source, that's a norm that you can't just change. And that would violate, some compact that we have, some unspoken compact that we have. And there's a very prominent US policy writer, Gary Huffbauer, who wrote a paper to explain why the US Trade Rep's position is correct, that there's a treaty violation or there's discrimination or blah, 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 some problem. And he talks about nexus as if treaties give it, that you get nexus based on the language in a treaty. That's backwards. That is absolutely backwards. Nexus is a thing any government claims by virtue of being a government. And how do you become a government? Well, in the history of the world, how do you become a government? You claim the territory by law, by force, by theft, by colonialism, by any means necessary. You take the power, you've got the keys to the kingdom, that's yours, and you get to say what you want. And nexus has never been limited by international law, never effectively, except by what we think, is in the law of war, which the US is the first one to violate. So, well, not the first one, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I'm saying. Countries violate territorial sovereignty all the time. So the idea that the US is going to hang its hook on a fuzzy notion of nexus and pretend that that notion is created by treaties, by tax treaties. That notion is not created by tax treaties. Tax treaties don't create nexus, they curb it. Their tax treaties are a way that countries say, we agree to end our claim. Our claim might be limitless. Some authors have said in the past, the right to tax is effectively limitless in international law. If so, then nothing can stop France, nothing can stop any developing country from taxing at source, so long as they make a plausible claim to themselves, a declaration of what their jurisdiction is. And that's why, maybe if you did that, maybe then the US would line up and want to have a tax treaty with you. I mean, again, just going back to where we started this conversation, it is the US who has the world's most expansive view of nexus when it comes to residence. And I complained about the US definition of residence, right? I said that definition is not normatively justifiable. I made all kinds of claims about it in writing, that it's not justifiable. But did I ever say it's illegal? No. Can the US call you, me, and everybody they want a US person for tax purposes? Yes, they can. Now, the question is not, can the US call me that? They can do whatever they want. They're a sovereign nation. No one's going to stop them. The question is, can they actually enforce their claim by force if necessary? Query whether the US can roll a tank down the streets of Montreal to pick me up if they decide I'm a US person. Not that easy, but instead of a physical relationship, we've made a bunch of treaties and agreements and tax information exchange and assistance in collection. And we've done all of those things to help the US have its nexus. Now, why is it that the whole world can marshal all of their resources to help the US with its absolutely expansive nexus, but the US absolutely denies that same right to everybody else?
But you see, the strangest thing that I found, with respect to what the US does a lot of time is, I found it very, 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 I don't know, we like to enforce all this, the FATCA, for example, and other tax treaty that we have. But it's impossible for the government, for the IRS, to force company to repatriate their income back to the US. And we have more than 15 trillion outside The U.S.
If the U.S. wanted to, they could. They don't want to. They don't want to. But why don't they want to? Because it puts more money in the shareholder if the foreign country does not tax. And you create pressure for foreign countries not to tax by not taxing at residence as well. I mean, it's just an economic reality. If you won't tax at residence, you can't tax at source.
All right, so let's talk about tax avoidance.
You're not sick of talking to me yet.
Right. let's talk about tax avoidance.
All right.
I mean, many experts, some, for example, the Tax Justice Network. I had a fascinating conversation with their executive, Alex Coban.
Yeah.
Yes, right. So we had a fascinating conversation that, I mean, I know we agree on. Actually, I'm part of the school of thought that word should not even exist, tax avoidance. You know, because to me, it's just giving tax evaders excuses.
Okay.
Place everything they can, utilizing every legal. I mean, we have to be cognizant of the fact that they are using legal mechanism, whether they are extreme or not extreme, is a subject of a different debate. But I think that word, I mean, that expression, tax avoidance, should not exist at all.
Okay. What happens when you, here's the problem with the word tax avoidance. What happens when you choose not to buy a product that's subject to sales tax? You avoid the sales tax.
Right.
What happens when you invest your money in a tax-free, in the US, in a tax-free municipal bond instead of a taxable corporate bond? You engage in tax avoidance.
Yeah.
What happens when you fudge the numbers and cherry pick your way through a transfer pricing study to justify an absolutely outrageous price for something, and the IRS does not catch you? Tax avoidance. What happens when you do that and the IRS does catch you, and then they spend 20 years arguing with you, and then the judge decides against you? Unsuccessful tax avoidance.
Right. Now, you know, the reason why I'm saying that word should not exist, because there's another word that could replace what you say, which is...
Okay, let's hear it. Well, but it's not, but here's why I don't agree with that.
Right.
Okay. Because if you're going to talk about tax evasion, then we're in the realm of criminal law.
Yeah.
And criminal law requires intent to evade. Right. So you're telling me that there's no difference between somebody who decides to invest in a municipal bond, and that is legal, but you don't have a word for it, and somebody who spends time working on transfer pricing in a firm to minimize taxes, when they're unsuccessful, you want them to have committed a crime. But the law is not always clear.
I agree. I see where you are going, and I agree with you. That position is firm. So that's why generally I say I agree with deductions. I agree with credit. I agree with amortization. I agree with any kind of mechanism except building schemes where there are foreign tax jurisdiction implicated, where, I mean, it's clearly, the intent itself is within the fact of the scheme, right?
Okay, so what's the solution to that, though? The solution...
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, what I was trying to say is that the intent would reside in the fact that you building all these schemes to reduce your tax liability, which is okay. There are ways to reduce your tax liability. You can invest in the community, right? You can have possibility where the government, the local government, or the federal government itself gives you incentive to invest in community organization, community programs.
You could pay people more than a minimum wage. That will reduce your profit.
Things like that. So you could do that instead of clearly, having 300 subsidiaries located all over the world and specifically in low tax jurisdiction.
Okay. So, I mean, look, here's, I think we just return right back to that discussion about illicit.
Right.
So this is how I would put it. I don't have a problem with anything you want to regulate away.
Right.
But if you can't articulate what you're trying to regulate, if you can't draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, if you can't do that because it's too, like, what are you going to say? Like 3 tax havens is okay, but 4 is too many? Or this just, you're going to have a white list and a black list? Those lists are always wrong.
I don't, I mean, if I have a country, I was telling Alex the last time, conversation, I said, look, if I have a country, I'm giving the possibility to, I know that's what they do. The only reason why they do these tax shelters through all this is because they don't want to pay the taxes. So I will not even tolerate that. I will not even accept it. In the law will be written.
Okay, so you have, okay, but you have law. This is what I'm telling you. Okay, I'm saying you have law. You have the sham doctrine. You have economic substance in some countries. You have GARS. You have SARS. What you don't have, I think, in a lot of places, is the capacity and the time and the resources to unravel what the taxpayer has, done in their wily, stirring up their stew. You can't unravel what they just mixed metaphors there. But as the taxpayer is constructing this beautiful, impenetrable fortress of a plan, the tax authority has all the law they need. What they don't have is time and resources and the capacity that the lawyers have. And that's not a problem of that you can point to one jurisdiction or another and say, it's their fault. It's the fault of the Cayman Islands or the Mauritius, or it's the fault of this or that. No, it's a systemic problem with a global economy, which is completely integrated. Capital can flow anywhere it wants. And the idea of intellectual property, attracting a lot of profit, and IP can be located anywhere it wants. And a whole host of financial and non-tangible goods and services, which defy, easy categorization. You can't get rid of those. Law can't get rid of complexity. The reason income tax is so messy and complex is because the world is messy and complex. So I don't think that all these categories or all this line drawing is, wrong or bad. I think it's complicated. And the way to solve complicated problems is by spending time. And it's hard and not very exciting work. It's hard work. It's boring. You have to learn a lot of law. You have to be an expert that, isn't any fun at cocktail parties. You become this person who just can spout off income tax act sections at will. But that's the hard work every day of the law. And I'm going to stand, as a defender of that, in the sense that I have absolutely no problem if you say to me, look at this company, the only reason they did X, Y, and Z is to save taxes, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that. Then I'm going to say, what do you mean by only? What do you mean by reason? What do you mean by, what are the alternatives? Where's the evidence? What's the law that's at stake? What rules are we working with? And if there's a problem with the rules, then we need to figure out how to fix those rules. But you can't get rid of that basic problem, which is that lawmakers have to write law. Lawmakers are imperfect. They don't understand all the variables, and they don't know how to write. They never know how to write. None of us could write a perfect law. And so in the implementation, lawyers interpret, judges interpret, administrators interpret. Everything gets a little muddy. And then it comes back to the lawmaker who looks and sees what has been done and says, I don't think it worked. Let's try again. And so when we go through that cycle over and over, we're going to always live out that cycle. And so I think as we do that, each time we go through that cycle, anytime someone says to me, but all these, tax lawyers, they're all a bunch of liars and they're willing to tell any story and they're really effectively tax evaders, my answer is always going to be the same. What is the law we're looking at? And how come they're getting away with that?
Yeah.
And if that's an administrative problem, we need to fix the administration. And if it's a legal problem, then we can fix the law, but we're never going to get it right.
Right.
We're going to be playing this game, and it is a game for taxpayers, unfortunately. You know, it's a high stakes game, but it's a game for taxpayers to a certain degree. And, you know, until the end of time, we will always be doing that. And so that's, I think, why I will always sort of stand up. Look, you're talking to someone who's got the bias of being law trained and a professor, an educator. So of course, I'm always going to have that same answer. That, you know, this is a systemic, it's a nature of law in a complicated society. What can we do but examine the law, find the errors, and root them out, and try to fix them? There isn't any other. There's no quick solution. There's only a hard, difficult, long-term problem to be solved, one after the other, and we just have to keep solving them.
Yeah.
That's not a very satisfying answer, I realize.
No, it's an answer which is, I take it. I will never discourage you from giving your own perspective on the issue. But let's jump on this issue of BEPS, right?
Yep.
So do you think the OECD? I mean, I know the OECD stands for developed countries, but they've been working on this base erosion and profit shifting for a while now. But do you think they have the interests of developing countries at heart?
No.
Okay. Do you
want more?
Want to develop your answer, please? Please.
I mean, no. You know, look.
Yeah.
I'm from a country that's well represented at the OECD.
Yeah.
We are a small resource-rich country that got rich as a result of colonialism, among other things, as well as natural endowments.
Yeah.
Familiar story, a story you've heard many times. But we're part of the OECD because we're developed.
Right.
We were developed at a time when the OECD built its membership, and so therefore we got our ticket into the club early. But it's a club. And what do clubs do? They serve their membership. Now, the OECD, I think, understands, and let me separate here the OECD as an institution, a monolith, and the people who work in different capacities within the OECD.
Okay.
Because the OECD as a monolith is an institution, and all institutions are about self-preservation. There's no getting around that. That is like a government in that sense. So I will say things about the OECD as that monolith, even though I know for a fact that the individuals who are working in the OECD are doing a lot, I think, to try to overcome those institutional realities. And I think a lot of people who work at the OECD actually really do care a lot about developing countries. I think there's a surprising, perhaps, number of people who care a lot about developing countries.
Okay.
But the structure of the institution is something you work with that you cannot escape. Right. So these are, you know, I've said critical things about the OECD in the past, and what I say to the OECD as a monolith, as an institution is, you know, I will never stop criticizing that institution so long as the institution does not accept its own governance has a basic problem. Its own governance structure is not transparent. It is not representative. It is not inclusive. It is not. And I have no choice. I have to critique them because I accept that they're the world leader in tax policy. And I will say they have had some excellent leadership that has really made the OECD into a powerhouse. I accept that, and I wouldn't say that I admire it, but I think it's worthy of note that there was a time when the OECD looked like it was going to collapse from lack of, you know, acceptance by its member countries. Its member countries didn't seem to value it very much, and then leadership really took the OECD in a new direction, and now here we are with it being the leader of, self-proclaimed leader of tax policy in the world. But there's something extremely offensive about a membership organization which has deliberately excluded developing countries since its inception. And is the voice of the developed world. If you look at its mantra, their first claim is to help the developed countries of the world. And oh, by the way, a secondary purpose is to make the rest of the world free market, like the OECD countries. So you can't escape that. And so that is why I say no, right? Like clearly no, developing countries are not at the center. And I'm frustrated, and I know others are frustrated, that at the meeting in Addis Ababa, the G77 proposed that the expert committee at the UN be constituted in such a way that it could become a real policy rival to the OECD. And the response of the OECD was the US and the UK and maybe a few other countries. I take it, I was not there, this is what I am told. The response was absolutely unequivocally no, that was not going to happen. The UN was not going to be elevated in any way. And the next day, it seems, the OECD announces the inclusive framework and starts talking about an equal playing field. Well, from the beginning, when I heard that equal playing field, I felt annoyed with it, because you cannot build tax policy on a metaphor. What does an equal playing field mean? First of all, what is the playing field? Are we playing soccer, football? Is this a game with 2 teams, 10 teams? Is it equal? Is there a good side of the field and a not so good side of the field? Are we switching sides? Like, the whole metaphor, to me, is so problematic.
Yes.
And when pressed, is the inclusive framework really inclusive? Like, what is the goal of what are the structure? What are the decision-making processes? How are the working parties? How does it work with the OECD? It's just always the same answer: equal playing field, level playing field, equal footing. I don't even know what an equal footing means. And so I don't like metaphor for this reason. It masks a lot of content that people might feel uncomfortable about confronting. And so when I confront that metaphor and I'm told equal footing and don't worry, and of course developing countries are at the center of this, I say, really? Because remember, law trained and professor and educator, what's my question? Where's the rule? Where's the rule that says how the inclusive framework is constituted? Explain to me how the inclusive framework can be under the OECD Council and beside the CTP. How's that, the Center for Tax Policy? How can that be? Who does the Secretariat serve? Does it serve the inclusive framework? No, it serves the OECD Council. It's sideways. The structure of the OECD is it's something you can go look in the OECD body book today. They're much more transparent than they used to be, but they're not nearly as transparent as they need to be. And I think until they take their own medicine about transparency and diversity, until they show us really what this is all about, I can't accept the notion that the OECD has developing countries at heart.
I mean, I agree with you 100%, So you preach it to the point.
Well, on that we agree.
Definitely. Now, before we finish, I wanted to have your own perspective on this announcement. The UK government, through the FRC, has announced that, has actually proposed an operational separation of audit units within the Big Four, right? I wanted to ask if what's your opinion on that? Are they going far enough, or is just good what they're asking these audit companies to do?
Yeah, so this is following the realization that a company whose job was to audit accepted the idea that there were accounts somewhere that didn't in fact exist, without getting any paperwork, without getting any, right? This is what started it again, this discussion?
Yeah, no, the discussion, I think, is following the $2 billion that disappeared from a company.
Yeah.
Yes,
The wire something.
Yeah, we wire.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
There was an accumulation of, because if you look at all the multinational fraud issues, they are all related to audit. Everything around the world, in South Africa, you name it, companies that just go bankrupt because of audit issues.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, I mean, because, you know, one of the issues has been to formally, and I had this conversation with the former commissioner of the IRS of the Philippines. She was telling me that in our country, in the Philippines, this company can only do audit.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot do
not planning.
They don't provide any other service, just to avoid this this conflict of interest, and just to let them do you know, the job of auditing. You know. And looking for, you know. So I wanted to ask you as a tax expert, because we lawyers sometimes it's not that we don't see eye to eye with accountant, but we don't do their work. Right? We don't audit companies. We don't. We don't look at what they're supposed to look
at.
The
financials,
financial and everything else, because we rely on their own opinion. But when it comes down to policy, tax policy, you see us pointing our fingers and our faces to say, hey, no, this right. You know. So I wanted to ask you, as a kind of policy, you know, what do you think? What's your perspective? Because, you know, it's been a long time that accounting firms have been, you know, if not living or you know, not doing audit properly, but taking up other position as advisory, business management, all kind of business things that are in total contradiction or, you know, in conflict with the way they're supposed to conduct their audit. I mean, WellCome was a big
and I'm thinking back to Enron, right? So Enron ended Arthur Andersen, like those, they used to be the big five, right? So Enron ended Arthur Andersen, and everybody fled to another firm. So it didn't actually get rid of the problem, it just dispersed it differently. So, you know, this problem of audit function and planning function, you know, is just a whole other world. And I really appreciate the people that have written about this problem. And I don't have a solution to this. You know, to be honest, I look at that and I say, I get it. I hear what you're saying. I understand that there is a big problem here. And a lot of times, you know, the way I confront that problem is that students have to decide whether they should take a job in an accounting firm or a law firm. And that's an age-old problem for students in the U.S., Canada, probably other places as well. And because the accounting firms are lousy with positions, they have all kinds of jobs, and the law firms just don't have as many jobs, and they have a more niche practice apparently, or something like that. It's changing trends. So when I confront that problem, and a law student asks me, should I go work in an accounting firm or a law firm? You know, I refer back to, you know, that idea that, well, what is the difference between what a law firm is doing and what an accounting firm is doing? And that has changed over the years. So I need to be a little careful here, because it's not my area of expertise, right? And I think there are people who really are experts about this dividing line between audit and planning. But the thing that I do know is that when I was working in a law firm, we often were considering the plan that had been put together by an accounting firm. And we were supposed to decide whether we as a law firm agreed with the analysis and whether that was a good, whether we thought that that was a good plan for the client. Right? We were giving advice, counsel of a lawyer as to whether that was a good idea. And a lot of those plans stunk. You know, they were really aggressive plans that you thought, you know, it probably works until the IRS sees it, figures out what's going on, and then tweaks a little bit, changes a word here and there to stop it. So we're right back to where we were with the question of illicit and the question of avoidance versus evasion and all of those things, right? When you're looking at that, when you see a plan, supposed plan, you think, well, it sort of works, but it's really aggressive and I don't like it. I'm not comfortable with it. And a lot of lawyers are not comfortable, but you can go down the street and get another lawyer that maybe is more comfortable. And that's a question of discernment and risk, you know, the risk that you can consider of being caught, being audited, being, you know, being pursued by that, through that by the IRS. There's a lot tied up in that. So I think, you know, it's probably safer for me to defer that to people who think about the structure of accounting firms, and I think who are themselves accountants and can understand why those two functions should be separated. And if that's a social good, then they should. But take the tax law consequences. The law is the same for the taxpayer, whether an accountant does the work or a lawyer does the work. Right. So I always am going to go back and say, you know, well, where's the lacuna in the tax law that needs to be fixed so that this kind of shenanigans don't turn into, you know, economic disaster, like fiscal macroeconomic disaster for countries, as, you know, like in an Enron situation, in the 2008 crisis situation, right? That's when you start to think systemically, you know, if there's some sort of massive problem that's a result of that. I have to leave that to the experts on that side of the table and stay over here in tax. In the law, on the law side, on the tax law side.
I agree with you. However, I gotta point out something. I mean, because, you know, every time that they have given the power to these corporate groups, I mean, accountant or bankers, to write their own, you know, to self-police themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been disastrous.
Yeah.
So
that doesn't shock me, right?
Because it does affect you and me.
Yeah.
Everybody else, because of the consequences. These corporations are tied to us, whether we are investors, passive or active or indirect, direct, you know, consumers as well. So it does affect society.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Point well taken. Yeah.
You know, repetition where there's fraud all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no week that goes by where an accounting firm is not being
accused of something.
So I mean, I think there is a huge societal, I mean, in the society that we have to, because as you said, you know, you clearly said, it's all about an agreement how we want our society to be run. You know, we agree among each other that, look, this is the way things supposed to go, then that's the way things supposed to. And if something is wrong, we as a society, we have to take that posture that, look, I think this group of individuals specifically, it's, I mean, why is it consistent? I mean, it's, you know, the facts are there. I mean, you just look at the fines, the violations that are, you know, every week, every year. You look at the amount of money. I mean, you look at the jobs.
And why don't they get investigated? Are there too many ties between people in the firms and people in government? Like, what's causing the?
Here's the thing. I mean, I actually take my own knowledge of this issue from a guy called Richard Brooks.
Oh yeah, he wrote a book on this.
Right,
islands.
A very, very important book on that. It's called you can see.
Oh yeah, I don't know that one. Okay.
Right. So he gives you the description, and he actually, I mean, he educated me. I mean, I have to be honest. He gave me the information that I never, ever imagined. That's how accounting or accountant were operating. You know, they operate in a very, I mean, it's like some mafia, you know, some group of people who decide this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to rob the world. And, you know, now having done so many research on this issue, I came to the conclusion that their behavior is actually affecting capitalism as a whole. Because all this inequality that, you know, Thomas Pinkerton, whether is my good friend Joseph Slickis, they are writing about, this inequality in the world is because people don't believe in capitalism anymore. I mean, I'm not saying we're leaving the issue of taxation up, but it's part of it, right? So it's something where this inequality seems to be cringe in everything that a regular citizen wants to do, but cannot do because this group of individuals, they have taken over society. I mean,
well, I think you've just described the very problem of, government, why people are frustrated a lot of times with government policy, because when it doesn't fix those problems, market problems, systemic problems, and people suffer, then they want to have a chance to choose maybe different leadership that will fix it. And if there is no leadership that will fix it, that all the parties are involved in, perpetuating inequality, it's really hard to understand how to get out of that. And I think that's right. I don't have a quarrel with that. I would agree with what you're saying. I don't think that people necessarily give up on capitalism. I think what they realize is that we don't have capitalism. We have something else, mercantilism to some extent, plutocracy in some places, a failure to curb monopolies, a failure to regulate, not enough protection of investors. I think we see the pressures in a lot of different ways. I would say when it comes to audit or fraud in financial reporting, you expect, in the US, you expect the SEC to be interested in that. But if they don't have resources to prosecute, then the investor is taking on risk, massive risk, like Enron type risk, like CDO risk and swap risk of the 2008 crisis, right? The investors are taking on that risk. And let's not forget that something like $5 trillion worth of value was lost in the 2008, 5T trillion was lost. Investors, but some people won, who knew what was happening and could see. So, but the investors lost, and millions lost their homes, and millions lost a great big chunk of their savings, and they're waiting for the economy to cycle back up again to recover. And then the pandemic hits. So these are the risks that we have. So I would say you take all of those problems, you take all of these regulatory issues, and I think each one of them is a problem of, a combination of laws, enforcement, in implementation, administration, judiciary. It's the whole ball of wax together. It's government writ large, all of the institutions we build to try to get better, to try to stop people from conning each other. And guess what? We humans are not very good at this. People can con us, they can steal from us. Those in the know will exploit those who aren't in the know. And again, we just come back all the time and say, well, the only thing that's worked, it's the old saying that capitalism is democracy is a terrible system except for everything else we tried, right? Same idea. The only thing that really has worked to prevent the worst abuses of humans, of each other, the worst exploitation, is law. That's how we've done it. That's how we got as far as we got. And have we achieved nirvana? Nope. Have we got better as a species? I don't really think so. Not really. But law has protected somebody like me. Right? Who back, in another time, in another age, would have had no rights whatsoever and no law. And now I do. So I'm a great proponent of law as a result, right? I'm a great proponent of the state. I appreciate the idea that law is what prevents the worst excesses and the worst abuses. But that never means that it's going to do the job that we think it should do. It's never quite adequate. It still allows exploitation and con men and con people. It's terrible. I just gendered the act of conning someone to be male. It's not true, but it's the term con men. All of those problems are still with us, and to the extent that they become systemic, where we are systemically being lied to by public records,
Yep.
Public financial reporting, then if the law is not there to prevent that, then that's where we should spend our time. We need to make sure the law is there to prevent that. We learn from the mistake of the past. We change the law, we change the administration going forward. And when you run out of runway, like there just is nobody around that isn't complicit, then you really find yourself in a bind that is well beyond the capacity of one tax professor sitting in Montreal to, say anything intelligent about.
Before you go, a final word. Do you think we are going to meet the 2030 goal of, the SDGs?
No, I think we've been set back by 10 years. The pandemic has probably set us back 10 years, if not more.
Yeah.
And I think the global leaders, the global capital owners have figured out how really been successful in hoarding, and they're not willing to share. And we haven't quite figured out how to get to the place where the kind of sharing that is needed will happen to fund those. So I don't think we'll make it.
Yeah.
No, I think there's zero chance of that. And I think we're meeting another crisis. We have the pandemic now, everyone's focused on it, but the coming climate crisis, obviously orders of magnitude above the current crisis. So we're just going to see the pressures increase. And I think the need for sustainable development has never been higher.
Yeah.
So we have the need, whether we have the political will, whether we have the ability to change the rules that need to be changed.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay. Allison Christian, it was a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. It's good to be lectured by you. I can't wait to be in Montreal one day and to assist and to participate in one of your classes. I think you're a fascinating and wonderful person. Thank you for accepting to participate in this conversation. And I hope the audience learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, the pleasure was all mine. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks.
Thank you. You have a good evening.
I will do it.
You have a good evening. Okay.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.